All right, Dick, do you want to get us started?
All right. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this program as part of the 2020 LERA virtual conference. Our subject could not be more important, that being building diversity in workplace dispute resolution. We're going to ask you to stay muted during the 1-hour presentation. And at the end, we prefer that you use chat to raise your questions. But if we have time, we'll certainly accept oral questions as well. We have an amazing panel today. We have, and this is the order of presentation, Professor Mark Gough from the School of Labor and Employment Relations at Penn State. We have Sarah Cudahy, who is the General Counsel of FMCS, who is bringing with us her polling technology that we've seen and is very, very sophisticated. We have Professor Homer LaRue from Howard University School of Law, who is both a mediator and an arbitrator. And we have Ms. Jacquelin Drucker, also an arbitrator from New York City and Ohio, and part of the Scheinman Institute on Conflict Resolution. Hopefully their bios are on the website, but these are 4 of the outstanding people to discuss diversity in the workplace. So our learning goal today is to explore the value and dimensions of diversity in mediation, arbitration, other types of workplace dispute resolution. And we're focusing on generally 3 topics. 1, the diversity of the roster. What is the data, which Professor Gough will talk about. Then we're going to talk about selection of neutrals by advocates, which Homer is going to talk about, and then we're going to talk about inclusion of diverse neutrals and other issues by Jackie, and Sarah, of course, is going to talk about the roster and do the polling. So we're very excited to have this panel and this general focus in such an important topic. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
Do you have, oh, great. Yeah, I just want to kick it off with some demographic data from a survey that was very generously funded by the National Academy of Arbitrators Research and Education Foundation, where I surveyed about 1,200 practicing workplace neutrals. So this is, as Dick said, this is labor arbitrators, labor mediators, NAA members, but also those affiliated with employment arbitration and on the rosters of JMs and the AAA. About 600 workplace neutrals got back, and that provides a pretty good snapshot, I think, of the demographics within the workplace neutral field. I mean, one very important constituency, actually of many, you know, that is missing in this are, again, FMCS, kind of mediators, and anyone that is not a member of these larger organizations. However, what this still brings into very sharp relief is that employment neutrals are overwhelmingly white men. And it does not reflect the demographics of society at all. If you look at gender, right, you're talking about 50% male, 50% female, as opposed to about 80% male in the workplace neutral professions. Likewise, I think around 60% of the United States would be classified as kind of white, Caucasian, yet 95% of workplace neutrals are going to be whites. Disabilities, right? This is where, how does one define it? But about 6% of workplace neutrals report having a disability, and that's about half of what the national average is. Likewise, if you look at sexual orientation, that 98% identify as heterosexual relative to the national average, even the most conservative statistics, right? It's that 5% are part of the LGBTQTA community, would, again, that's yet only 2% would identify within that categorization within the existing neutral profession. And we can, I think, attempt to rationalize these statistics, right? Or we can confront them in a very thoughtful and purposeful way, which I hope this is part of what we're doing today. And that's my intention for this panel, and hopefully as LERA as an organization as well. And at that, I think I hand it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining our panel. My name is Sarah. I'm with FMCS, and I'm going to provide two perspectives on diversity and dispute resolution. And the first one is a government perspective, both in my current role at FMCS and also my former role as Executive Director of the Indiana Education Employment Relations Board. So a couple of things that are a little bit different from the government perspective on increasing diversity and dispute resolution. And the first one is this question of what is diversity and dispute resolution. So I would agree with all of the bases that Mark points out in what we would typically think of diversity. But I know at the state level and at the federal level, we're also looking at another one, which is in collective bargaining cases to ensure that we have neutrals that are reflected from both labor side and management side. So that's an additional consideration that we have when we're looking to recruit and maintain the neutrals that we have. As to the next slide, we also have a difference in how we increase diversity. So Homer's going to talk a lot about the selection of panels. And at FMCS, we have arbitrator panels that parties will select as well. But in addition to that, at FMCS, we employ, most of our employees are mediators. And so for that, of course, we go through the traditional employment practices. At the state, we also had employees. We also had ad hocs, but those ad hocs were chosen by the executive director. And then we also had board members that were neutrals who were chosen by the governor and the legislature. So depending on how neutrals are selected and how they come onto panels and what processes and cases that we use really impact how it is that we need to look to increase diversity in dispute resolution. Again, it can be somewhat complicated because of the different decision makers in those different areas. Okay, for the next slide, then what I want to talk about are some successes, but of course, always still striving for that. So one thing I know at the state and also at FMCS that there's really been a big push with senior management is with the gender parity here. So I'll give you an example. At the state, when I started, there were no board members who were women, nor had any woman ever served as a board member. When I left, it was 60%. Similarly, we had an increase in mediators, arbitrators, and financial consultants at the state level. Similarly, at FMCS, we're seeing much higher numbers of women than what we saw in Mark's data. And even in the last couple of years with senior management, we've seen some great strides with that. Similarly, with that sectoral diversity, and this is a tale of two different agencies, right? So at FMCS, traditionally, we were known as being union heavy. And now we have a better balance of union and management. And at the state of Indiana, we had, when I started, no board members that had a union background. And when I left, it was 40%, similarly with the staff. So some successes in those bases of diversity, but in other bases, still things where we have to work harder to make sure that we can get that diversity in with the neutrals. And as Homer will talk about their selection, but again, also making sure that we have recruitment in place. So that's a little bit about the government perspective. And now we want to turn it to you to get your perspective. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a link in the chat box. And if you can go ahead and click on that link, and it's going to take you to a poll. This is anonymous, so we won't know who's filling it out. You're going to see 5 different questions there, 2 of which, if you want to add information in a comment box, you can. Once you're done, hit save and submit, and we'll collect all that data. I'm going to give you about a minute. If this doesn't come up as a link for you, you can copy it and paste it in your browser. If you don't know how to find your chat box, don't worry. Just hover your cursor over either the bottom or top of your screen till your menu comes up, and you should see chat right there in the middle. Just click on that and you can go to the browser. This is our Facilitate Pro software. So I'll give you about a minute to complete that polling.
And it's working fine here.
Okay, great. I specifically did not put a definition of diversity in here because I want you to answer that question, whatever you believe is the appropriate definition of diversity. Okay, if you can go ahead and just look up when you're done. If you need more time, you can just let me know in the chat box. Okay. All right, Kevin, it looks like most people are looking up, so if you will go ahead and tabulate. So we have a wonderful mediator tech with us, Kevin Buffington from FMCS, who's agreed to help on the back end with our polling. So he's going to tabulate that. While he's doing that, here's how we're going to, this is a choose your own adventure panel. You had no idea what you were coming into when you clicked on the stream. So I'm going to share my screen when we've tabulated results. We're going to go chart by chart through the results and I'll show it to you. If you would like to do that on your own, once Kevin has said the tabulation is done, then you can click on the link in the chat box again and look at the charts yourself. Or you can do both. So it's sort of up to you how you want to see these results.
Go ahead,
and we'll
Sarah.
go through them.
Go ahead,
okay, perfect. Thank you, Kevin. Okay, so I am going to set this chart up and then I will share it with you. And we'll see what we've all come up with together here. Okay.
Do I need to do a stop share?
Yes, if you could stop share, I will share my screen. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. So if somebody could give me a heads up when you see it.
Yes.
You good?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So again, if you want to do this yourself, you can click on that link again and put it up in your browser and you can see the chart. So let's run through some of these questions. You're going to see on some of them select here on some of these charts. That will mean that somebody did not complete the question for whatever reason. So just watch that. If there's one question in particular that people didn't want to answer, I think that's always an interesting point of conversation as well. So question number one, would you consider yourself diverse? And we have almost 78% said yes. So what an interesting statistic when you look at the numbers that Mark gave us earlier. So
can you
the
zoom
next,
in a bit?
oh yeah, sorry. Can you see, let me see. Here we go. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, so our second question here is, what is the biggest challenge to diversity in dispute resolution? So we see a little bit all over the board, but it looks like the number one here is people choose neutrals like themselves. And then the second one was lack of potential diverse neutrals entering the field. So you can see here the lack entering the field. So those two are by far the largest vote getters here as to reasons, challenges to diversity. Now our third one, I talked a little bit about some of the considerations for government in increasing diversity and dispute resolution, but I wondered what you guys thought our role should be in increasing diversity. And so again, we have a little bit more of differences of opinion here, and you see that select here. So we did have someone that didn't want to tell us what they thought, which is perfectly fine. So we see some people aren't sure. Most people think that government has a role, but we're a little bit undecided on what role the government should have in that. Okay, so this chart reflects your thoughts on extensive systemic intervention, and this is really keying up for Homer's presentation. We're going to talk about this. So we look and we see, Homer, it looks like most people, the majority out there, think that either moderate or extensive systemic intervention is needed for increasing diversity and dispute resolution. And then we have our last item here, which is, do we agree that there's unconscious or implicit bias in the selection of neutrals? And here we have a pretty strong indication of strongly agree and then somewhat disagree, or somewhat agree. Nobody disagrees or didn't know about that one. So that's a very strong indication there, Homer, on some of the slides I know you're going to talk about, and Jackie, about unconscious or implicit bias in the selection of neutrals here. So let me see some voting comments. I see it happening in people that are hired, and also maybe some thoughts that aren't progressive on how we're looking at the selection of neutrals here in terms of the comments. So thank you everyone for participating and telling us your perspective on increasing diversity in dispute resolution. I'm now going to stop my share and I'm going to throw it over to Homer.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
I was going to give you a few minutes, Homer, to pull it up.
Yeah, it's not.
Excellent content, and we love the polling software. And it's, I just can't imagine that it's just in chat. It is so easy to use.
Do you see it now, everybody?
Nope.
Oops. It was working. Where was it? For some reason, my share screen isn't coming up. One participant. Richard, you're not sharing, right?
Nope, I'm not sharing.
And Sarah, you gave yours up.
Sarah, you want to try to do it? I know you've got the backup.
You're muted, Sarah.
Yep, let me see if I can, I've got it, and let me share my screen. Hang on 1 second.
Chris, I've never had this one happen.
Ah, there we go.
There we are. And if you could hit the slides, please, slideshow. Here we go. Good afternoon. Sorry for the technical glitch. As I said, I've been teaching this stuff, and this is the first time this has happened. At any rate, what I want to talk about is addressing unconscious bias in the selection of neutrals. And I want to talk about the plan for addressing that issue. Next slide, please. The presentation is based on an article that will be coming out in the Howard Law Journal, and we'll get that posted as soon as we have the Westlaw site. The agenda for my presentation today is briefly to discuss what I call the front end issue, which Mark and Sarah addressed, but I'm going to primarily deal with the back end issue, and I'll explain what those are, and thinking outside the box with regard to addressing the back end issues based on empirical data. And finally, end with a brief discussion of the plan for that, which I call the Ray Corollary Initiative. Next slide, please. So we know about Jay-Z's cry of alarm in New York, and that's what gave additional attention to this. And we know that about the numbers and why they're not changing, and most of you saw that. Next slide, please. I and a number of other persons on this panel are members of the National Academy of Arbitrators, which is a membership organization, probably would be considered the most premier labor and employment membership organization in the field. And the interesting thing is that Mark's statistics are certainly reflected in this 75-year-old organization, of which I am a member as well. Next slide, please. what you'll see in the next slide are the bars. Each colored bar represents a person who became a member of the Academy. It's a little hard to see, but I can tell you that the first one was in 1950. And then there was not another person of color to enter the Academy until 1966. And you can see the progression. What on the left side, these are actual names, and we have the names, I didn't put them in here. Across the top are the years in which people came into the Academy. And as I say, each one of these colored bars represents when that person came in and whether they are still in. Next slide, please. The summary that I want to call your attention to is in the final two bullets. The total number of persons of color admitted to the Academy in its 75-year history is 43 persons out of approximately 1,500. The percent of the membership that in the Academy who are persons of color is around 3%. And so what we know, what Alan and I, my co-author and I have found exactly what Mark was talking about in his study as well. Next slide, please. So for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to be talking about diverse neutrals, and this is how I'm defining them. Persons of color, women, persons with disabilities, and persons in the LGBTQ plus community. Next slide, please. So what are we doing here now? We're trying to look at this issue from a new perspective, I hope. That the selection of the neutral process, what we want to know is what is in the black hat. And the black hat is the selection process and what needs to be uncovered. Next slide, please. And if we look at the diagram, we know that the advocates receive a list of potential neutrals. And then there's the neutral selection process, either the strike process or the selection of the neutral. That's the magic black hat. And nobody knows what's going on in there. Or do we? I think we do. What we know in terms of the outcome is that the selected neutral usually represents the status quo. And as Mark has indicated, among neutrals is the same among advocates. Primarily, not exclusively, but primarily white males are doing the selection. Next slide, please. So what we're doing now then, hit the button, please, is what we come up with, or what we know is that the advocate is saying, either consciously or unconsciously, I'm picking the arbitrator or mediator who I know. Hit the button again, please. And so what that translates to, we know, is unconscious or implicit bias. Next slide, please. So what's the question which we should be concerned about? The question is, does it matter who and how many are in the slate of finalists for the selection of a neutral? Now, let me emphasize that I'm not talking about the front end issue, which would have to do with the pool of neutrals. Yes, we still need to concentrate on that as an issue, but that's not what I'm concentrating on. I'm concentrating on the other part, the selection part, because I firmly believe that it's hard to encourage people to come in and try to be a labor and employment neutral if they're never going to get selected so that they can make a living doing this work. And that's why this is an important part of what we in the ADR community need to be concentrating on. So keep in mind that what we're talking about is the slate of finalists for selection of the neutral. Next slide, please. So what we know, and what I'll talk about in a few minutes, is what the empirical data tells us. And that is that when the status quo, the number of people who go into that black box or black hat, looks like this, what you see on your screen, it shouldn't be surprising to anyone that the selection outcome is going to reflect that status quo. Next slide, please. Indeed, even if you add one person of diversity to that pool, the likelihood of a diverse person being selected is next to zero. Next slide, please. So the question is, and the question that the empirical data tells us, is that when the pool of candidates contains at least 30% diverse persons, the chance of a diverse candidate being selected goes up exponentially. Next slide, please. Now, the data that I'm going to be talking about is based upon studies that have been done and that were published in the Harvard Business Review. Next slide, please. So one of the studies, and these did not have to do with the ADR community, they had to do with hiring in the university. And notice what they found, that when the pool consisted of 3 men and 1 woman, the chances of the woman being hired was zilch. That's the lowest one. When it became 50-50, there was a 50% chance. But look at this. This is a rather significant increase. 3 women, 1 man. Now there's a 67% chance of a woman being selected. So next slide, please. What is it that we should be taking away from this? Well, one is that 2 women in the finalist pool out of 4. Hit the button, please. Then the odds of hiring a woman is 79.14% times greater. Next slide, please. If we talk about persons of color, this is truly significant. Mark perhaps can explain and critique the statistics, because I barely got through ILR statistics when I was in grad school. So I'm not a statistician. But I think this is still a remarkable number, 194% increase or likelihood of a selection of a person of color. Next slide, please. So what we know then is that when there is only 1 diverse person in the pool of finalists, what's happening is that that difference from the norm is accentuated. Next slide, please. And then when you translate that into who's doing the selection, who are primarily lawyers. And what do we know about lawyers? And I'm a lawyer. We know that lawyers are risk adverse. They do not want to say to their client, I chose a new arbitrator, I chose a woman, or I chose a person of color because it was the right thing to do. Oh, and we lost the case. So what the lawyer is saying, it's risky to deviate from the norm or the status quo. And therefore, what does the lawyer do? The lawyer selects who the lawyer knows. Next slide, please. Hit the button. And that translates into I select who I know. And next button. Who I know looks like me. And as we've already indicated, many, not all, but most of the advocacy community are white male. Probably somewhere over 45 to 50 is the latest statistics that I've seen. So it's not unusual for us to see what we know is happening. All right, that's the problem. Let's go to the next slide. Now I want to talk about 3 things: the Rooney Rule, the Mansfield Rule, and what I call the Ray Corollary Initiative. And the Ray Corollary Initiative is based upon what we know has been done to try to increase diversity using the Rooney Rule in football and the Mansfield Rule in big law. I won't dwell very much on either one, but I need to say a couple of things. Next slide, please. So the Rooney Rule was adopted in 2003 and was named for the then Pittsburgh Steelers chairman, Dan Rooney. Essentially, it requires teams to interview at least 1 minority candidate for a head coaching vacancy and for a major front office position. Next slide, please. With all of the problems, all the limitations of the Rooney Rule, the studies that I have seen still say that it has had significance in terms of affecting the number of black coaches, black head coaches in NFL. In fact, in one of the Super Bowls, the two teams who were playing were both coached by black coaches after the Rooney Rule was put into effect. Now, next slide, please. As I said, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, and I can say more about the Rooney Rule and the efforts. Probably many of you have seen the critique of the Rooney Rule in the newspapers in the last few weeks, and we can come back to that. Let me move on to the Mansfield Rule. Next slide, please. I want to talk about what it is and then how it works. Next slide. The organization, hit the button, please, initially worked with a group of 102 law firms. Their objective was to ensure that if that law firm was to be Mansfield certified, it had to pledge to have 30% diverse lawyers for all governance and leadership roles. That's what they were looking to do, not just hiring, but promotion to partnership and pitch teams. Law firms go, as you know, survive on being able to get new clients. Next slide, please. The firms committed themselves to keeping data that they had firmly considered at least 30% women, attorneys of color, LGBTQ+, and lawyers with disabilities. And what did consider mean? Consider for equity partner promotions, for formal client pitch opportunities, and for senior lateral positions. Next slide, please. White and Case, after completing its 2019 certification, put this statement, which I find quite interesting, on their firm website. And notice that what they've said is that the 30% metric and the built-in accountability have had a positive effect on encouraging their leaders to expand the pool of talented lawyers that they develop. There are two concepts in there then that are important for our discussion. One is the 30% metric, and the other is accountability to one another and to whoever is overseeing the initiative. The next slide, please. Now, that brings me to my idea for the ADR community. This is what I call the Ray Corollary. The corollary is named, I call it a corollary because it's based upon the Rooney Rule and the Mansfield Rule. So I didn't think it was legitimate to call it a rule. But it is, we all know from mathematics that a corollary to a rule is important. Charlotte Ray graduated from Howard University School of Law in 1872 and was the first Black woman to receive a law degree in the United States and the first to be admitted to a bar in the United States. So we're going to talk about what the corollary is and what the plan is for the initiative. Next slide, please. And quite simply, what we're talking about is expanding the work that has been done and the lessons that we've learned in big law via the Mansfield Rule and via the Rooney Rule to the arbitration mediator selection process in the ADR community. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? Hit the button. First of all, it means a commitment by and a collaboration among the sections of the American Bar Association. Next. Those entities that maintain arbitrator rosters. Next. Those lawyers and others who select arbitrators. Next. And those public and private entities that hire the lawyers who select arbitrators and other neutrals. That's the community of people we're aiming at here. Next slide, please. So the Ray Corollary Initiative would be the title for a national task force. And that task force would reach out and partner with an entity like Diversity Lab to join with the ADR community to help bring about the diversity in the selection of ADR neutrals. Next, please. We've already taken the first step. The National Academy of Arbitrators, its Board of Governors established the RCI Organizing Committee. And that organizing committee has been tasked with establishing the RCI National Task Force. And that task force is the entity that is intended to implement the Ray Corollary Initiative. Next, please. And what is that intended to do? The task force would set about developing an internal rule modeled in accordance with Title VII and adapt that rule to specifications that will best fit the procedures of the ADR community, recognizing that the ADR community is diverse and that one rule can't fit all. So I'm not trying to suggest that I have all the answers at this point. The National Task Force will develop those and then help those entities to institute a rule described above, always with the finalist pool containing this 30% diversity that I've been talking about. The next slide, please. The final element, and then I'll wrap up, is that accountability, as White and Case said, the 30% metric and accountability are the two core principles that have to go into participation in the Ray Corollary Initiative. And that means collecting and sharing data that's related to the participants' RCI commitment. Next, please. Now, so that means next, the Ray Corollary Task Force would be a national effort, would be a collaboration among all the stakeholders who would be members of the National Task Force, and their commitment would have to be the 30% metric that I have been talking about for participating, and accountability and transparency. That means keeping data and sharing data so that we can monitor what entities are actually doing in order to achieve this. Final slide, please. I shouldn't say final because I don't think it is. Yes, it is. The RCI would then be the ADR community's demonstrable commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the selection of diverse neutrals. Thank you. I committed myself to 20 minutes. Did I make it?
10 seconds, yes, tremendous. Thank you, Homer. And while we change slides, and Sarah, if you could release, I would ask that everyone go to chat and think about asking questions of Homer and anyone else on the panel. And while you do that, are you now looking at the PowerPoint? Yes.
We are.
Okay, Jackie, take it over. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack. And I will be brief because we want to ensure that there is time to talk about the points made, and especially Howard's most exciting and promising plan for addressing what we're exploring here today, which are the efforts that are being made or could be made or should be made to increase diversity and inclusion, not just in the pool of active labor and employment neutrals, but also in the frequency with which they are tapped to serve, which is the goal Homer's looking to achieve here, so that full careers as neutrals can be built. The diversity expert, Verna Myers, in our next slide, has said that diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. So what we're talking about here really correlates to the front end and the back end that Homer's talking about. Diversity, I see as increasing the diversity within the pool of available neutrals. From which that are developed by whatever entities are creating rosters and panels and so forth. Inclusion then is the frequency, and improving inclusion is increasing the frequency with which those individuals are chosen to serve as neutrals, because it's through that process, through the dancing part of this equation, that individuals achieve the recognition within the relevant labor management community, so that they have a name that pops to mind when that black hat process that may not even involve a list takes place, when counsel sit and say, gee, who might we agree on to mediate this proceeding? Or labor and management sit down and say, what arbitrators do we want to list in our collective bargaining agreement? I think a key part of inclusion is making sure that diverse individuals are among those whose names come to mind as part of that process. As we search for methods to do this, I think the approach that Sarah described being taken at FMCS, the plan that Howard has described, are going to prove very, very promising. I also think we need to look, however, at not just the front end, but the broader scope of the labor and employment profession generally, because that's the pipeline through which neutrals move into neutral service. And I hope that we can begin to examine efforts to increase and improve the diverse representation in labor and employment law, in labor relations, in union leadership, and those opportunities and experiences that prepare people for being neutrals, but also just adjust the landscape of the systems in which we serve. And to do that, I think we need to look not just at the law schools, but even go to high schools and community colleges and looking within unions and universities to see what we can do to ensure interest in and opportunities in our field of labor and employment law and our field of labor and employment relations, and also in dispute resolution generally. There are a number of programs that exist that help to achieve this. One, for example, through the American Arbitration Association, is their Higginbotham Fellows Program, which provides a select group of people, now every other year, it used to be every year, with a very deep immersion into the American Arbitration Association's approach to dispute resolution. And the Higginbotham Fellows Program has always focused on a diverse group of fellows, and it has provided a variety of opportunities for people to develop careers not only as neutrals, but also in fields using dispute resolution. As we look through these programs and as we look through these strategies, however, I think it's useful to keep in mind the quote that you see on the screen by Peter Drucker, to whom I claim absolutely no relation whatsoever. But he has said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So when we look at our plans and our statistics and our goals, we need to also think about whether the culture of the institution, of the organization through which we're implementing these strategies, and also the society in which we function, is developing a culture that values and promotes and is profoundly committed to enhancing the opportunities for diversity and to engaging in those steps that will root out and eliminate bias and also ensure anti-racist steps within that culture. Because if we don't have the change within the culture, I think we've seen it in the past, that a lot of good strategies kind of fizzle and die because there's only a small portion of an organization that is truly committed to it philosophically and with the profound kind of commitment that we need. And speaking of that, and taking a look at the times in which we now are operating, which are incredibly promising and exciting, looking at the wave of change within our culture, I think it's worth examining what those of us who have built our careers on a wave of white privilege can do to better understand, to better hear, and to just do better in terms of fighting racism and ensuring diversity and inclusion. One of our colleagues, I think he's known to most of the people participating in this session and attending, is Arthur Matthews, a diversity trainer and also a neutral associated with Cornell and NYU and Howard. And he is a strong proponent of the implicit bias tests, the most significant one being the one developed by the Harvard Implicit Bias Project. And there's some question as to how accurate, even by the developers, how accurate on an individual basis the implicit bias or implicit association test may be. But I suggest it's worthwhile simply because of the methodology, and going through the structured approach that they've developed can be something of a jolt and a wake-up call simply by engaging in the exercise of taking that test. And it's offered for a variety of different associational factors. That's one thing. There is an endless list, of course, of reading and videos and movies and lectures and TED Talks that we need to expose ourselves to. I offer just one small suggestion in terms of helping to understand and to do better. And that is a book that you see on your screen, Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. I read a few years ago, and it's a quick read the first time through, but you'll want to read it again. And it is what Toni Morrison called required reading, and she described it as an examination of the hazards and hopes of Black male life. And as we attempt to improve ourselves and do better, I think it is just one of a number of steps that we can take as we examine ourselves and our society and try to improve our culture and achieve greater diversity and inclusion within our own community of labor and employment relations. And Dick?
Thank you, Jackie, very insightful. Again, we ask each of you to go on chat and raise some questions. And now Mark, who's been looking at the chat questions, is going to lead us in some discussion as to what you've asked. And then if we have time, and we only have 10 minutes, we'll open it up to anyone just to speak. So Mark, you're muted, Mark.
Okay. That's because my kids just came home. The chat has been quite quiet, so if you do have questions, please feel free to ask in the chat function, and or at this point, I think we can also feel free just to unmute and ask it directly. Someone on their iPad asks, though, that we should also consider how to amplify networking opportunities as well. Does any panelist want to talk about perhaps the role that just networking opportunities?
I'll start that off. Some years ago, I and another colleague started an initiative called Access ADR in conjunction with JAMS. And an integral part of that was networking. And networking we defined as putting those neutrals together with the people who would be selecting neutrals so that they would get to know one another on a social level as well as a professional level. That part worked out. I don't know whether that worked. I'm convinced that it's necessary because we couldn't get past the first step, and that was lawyer aversion to using people whom they hadn't used. So we couldn't get enough buy-in to get to that. But I do believe that networking is important.
That was me trying to unmute people, not realizing there was family members. So everyone's muted. And so Homer, unmute yourself and continue. I'm sorry.
No, that was
okay.
I had finished mine.
If I could jump in, I think that one of the points that I was making about reaching out to the next generation of neutrals, which is something that the Scheinman Institute, with which Dick is associated and I am too, have been very involved with, is the opportunity to bring along individuals who might not even be thinking of a career as a neutral. And there are networking opportunities through education, also through something that I mentioned as the Higginbotham Award, but I think, or fellowship, but I think also a critical component is the professional organizations. LERA is one, the bar associations. And it's important for aspiring neutrals to know to network not just with fellow neutrals, who can of course be helpful as mentors and coaches, but also those who actively select neutrals. And those kinds of networking opportunities should be enhanced by especially our bar associations and organizations like LERA.
Dick, why don't you stop the share screen? It might be easier for everyone to interact.
And we just had someone
There you
raise
go.
their hand.
Oh,
Chris. Go on. Go on, Mark.
Should I go ahead? My question is about the agencies. If, I don't know the practice in the US, but let's assume that the parties cannot agree and an appointment has to be made by AAA or FMCS. Can't they build into that diversity appointments at a higher percentage to give people more exposure, so that, let's say, you'd put in, you know, at least 1 in every 4 or 1 in every 3 or 40% must be diversity candidates if the parties can't agree, and that gives people exposure?
I'll begin to respond to Chris on that. And just to say that a colleague of mine, Michael Green, who teaches heads the labor program at Texas A&M, has just written a law review article that comes out, is either out or will be out shortly in the Fordham Law Review. And that's exactly his proposal, that the logarithm that both AAA and FMCS use to select would be altered in those situations. And well, he goes a little bit further in saying that list might even be exclusively diverse.
If I could note that the American Arbitration Association is looking at the possibility, it's less relevant in labor arbitration, more significant in employment arbitration, of the potential to promote diversity and inclusion in the designation of the chair on three arbitrator panels, those that consist of 3 neutrals. And it has not been exactly clear over the years how exactly that happens. And there's an effort underway to develop a set of criteria. It's a determination to be made by AAA as the administering entity, and diversity among the 3 arbitrators, and diversity as a goal in designating the chair is one of the factors that I think is probably going to be formalized.
Interesting. Other questions?
And I'm just reading, Jed made just a comment about how, 90% of the arbitrations are performed by 10% of arbitrators. And I do think there's some truth, truth to that. But also, I've done some work actually analyzing the networks of neutrals as well. That same survey, when I asked about the demographics, again, any arbitrators in the room, I know some of you, at this point it's been a year, perhaps more than a year since you've taken it, but I asked about networks as well, defined as basically what people do you go to if you have a professional problem. And it turns out that overwhelmingly professional networks are homogenous, right? They reflect our demographics. However, those with diverse or heterogeneous networks it's correlated with more cases and higher fees and higher professional satisfaction. And so I can't say any kind of causal element there, but there is evidence, again, that at least the top arbitrators do in fact have more diverse networks than the average arbitrator listed on a panel.
One of the things that we're doing in the Academy that I helped to start is something that I participated in some 30, 40 years ago, we call it a salon. And the classic notion of a salon is a place where people can gather and have conversation in a safe space, asking anything that they want to ask. No, it doesn't become public. And we're now in our second iteration of the salon in the DC, Philadelphia area. And one of the things that we have been able to do, and hopefully will increase it even more, is to do an outreach to persons of color, and certainly other diverse persons as well, so that hopefully Mark will change that a little bit and make it possible for people. I see two people, I won't name their names because I don't want to embarrass them, but I see two people who are in this seminar who are members of the salon. And one is a veteran, the other one is coming in. But we hope that that is one way of increasing the network and giving opportunities, not to brand new arbitrators, because remember, the Academy doesn't admit new arbitrators. They admit people who have had lots of experience, which means that they are highly acceptable to the labor management community. And so we're trying to help those who are not quite at the place of eligible for membership yet, but are close.
Homer, I'm wondering if you've got any thoughts on what we're seeing in terms of the age distribution. Mark's research, and Mark, you can probably offer the more precise numbers here, but I think the overall pool, regardless of what you're looking at, labor, employment, multi-neutral, consists heavily, the vast majority are between the ages of 60 and 80. And certainly there's room in our profession. As I mentioned, Marty Scheinman calls it the next generation of arbitrators. There's room in our profession for younger people. Are you seeing that as some kind of impediment, or is that a factor we need to bring into play as we work to make the Ray corollary a functional process?
Yeah, I think that age is an important part of it. What I like about what we've done in the salon is that we've identified primarily people, certainly who are younger than I am. Of course, that may not say so much anymore either. But yes, that's an important part. We're looking to try to, and I think what's important is whatever initiative is undertaken in this way has to have, as a part of it, creating opportunities for newer arbitrators to meet the advocacy community. So getting them into conferences, very important, so that they can be on panels and the advocates can hear them and understand how they think, how they would hold a hearing, and how they would write a decision. Those are important ingredients.
So we have 2 minutes left. One last question is possible.
Well, I want to.
Well, can I jump in? Oh,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sarah.
I was going to add too, as we think about networking, which I think is very important. One thing I would add from my perspective is, and I worked at a law firm, and I worked very hard to go to all that networking stuff. A lot of it was at night. And as a mother of young children, I no longer can attend those. And I know that there was some statistics, but a while ago about particularly women. I don't know about other bases, and particularly women that would be younger than the 60 to 80 age demographic, and how it is really hard to get sometimes into networks when the traditional networking is later. And I know there has been a lot of movement to doing lunch-based and webinars and things like that, but I just added as one of those things we have to think about when we do networking is how do we network too, to make sure that we're being inclusive as well with that.
May I make one last statement before? It's not contrary to anything that Sarah said. But I want to encourage us. The RCI is scary because it calls for a change in the culture. It calls for a systemic change in the way that we've been accustomed to selecting arbitrators and mediators. All of the front end issues, they're important and we've been doing them. My greatest fear is that we will run away from the back end issues because they are so thorny.
So with that, I would like to thank the panelists for very insightful observations. We're all clapping. And I would also like to invite all of you to join the dispute resolution section of LERA. Several members on this screen are leaders in that section, and Mark and I are one of the co-chairs. I'm terming off. And the dispute resolution section of LERA has a strong commitment to this subject of career development and diversity. And I know, speaking for Mark and others, that we encourage you to join. There's no additional cost beyond the national leadership fee. So with that, we thank you. This has been a tremendously fascinating discussion. It should have been 3 hours. It could have easily have been 3 hours. So we thank you all, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.